This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Hello, everybody. These days, the very concept of truth is around for many different reasons. And nobody has more expertise dealing with truth than philosophers. And we're going to learn more about that today in this interview with Dr. Thomas Teufel, who is an associate professor and chair in the Department of Philosophy at Baruch College, Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Teufel is a native of Naus am Rhein in Germany. That's close to the Netherlands border, right?
It's pretty close to the Dutch border. Okay. It's called Neuss.
Neuss?
Neuss.
I thought it was not. Okay. It's because EU is as OE normally. Okay. He graduated from the Heinrich Heine Universität in Düsseldorf, a master's from the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and a PhD from Harvard University. You have been around at different places getting all your degrees.
Yes, I've been around the block.
Okay, that's good. So many people, when you talk about philosophy, say, well, what do actually these people do? So let me start for a very straightforward question is, why do you become interested in philosophy? What made you to become a philosopher?
I was actually interested in art. Growing up, I wanted to become an artist, painter in particular, and I reached a point when I had to make up my mind what course of study to embark upon, where I'd visited art schools, and I found that the art that was produced was oftentimes either overly intellectual or underly intellectual. It was either just sort of spilling from the gut or trying to do something that seemed to me philosophy, and just in the wrong medium. And I tried to decide what to do, and I figured one way to know how to become an artist would be to find out what philosophy is and also what philosophy is not, in order to be able then to paint. And I'm still stuck in the figuring out what philosophy is portion of that equation.
Let's explain to our audience what the word philosopher means, because I think that should tell us a lot about what you do.
That's correct. So it's philosophy comes etymologically from the Greek philosophia. Sophia means wisdom, and philo means lover of. So a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And as the Greeks would say, wisdom in all of its forms. Plato has a very nice encapsulation of this in his very famous, justly famous statement that from the Apology, that the unexamined life is not worth living. And that's what philosophers do. They examine life in all of its forms.
Would you say that the definition of seeker of the truth is also applicable to philosophers?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the questions that philosophy is engaged in, is what is truth? Is there such a thing as truth? If there is such a thing as truth, what would it be, and how would we know it? All of these are philosophical questions.
Now, in this era, people talk about the post-truth era, or alternative facts and fake news and all that sort of things. I wonder how you philosophers feel about it, because this is in many ways an enunciation of what you actually do, like saying we don't care about the truth, we invent the truth. Right. How do you as a community, and the intellectual community, feel about these times we're going through?
Well, in some ways, I think we've seen this show before, once again going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Plato himself was complaining about the rise of rhetoric, which was supposed to be conversation designed to convince you of a certain belief without regard to the truth value of that belief. And Plato said what we should be interested in is the truth of the matter. So this is nothing new. And philosophers are lovers of wisdom, lovers of truth, and in that sense deeply concerned about the rise of fake news and alternative facts and all of these.
Okay. Now, one may ask, that sounds very nice, but why do we need philosophers?
So it's a very good question, and it's a question that we've also had to deal with for the last 2,000 plus years. Some of us were killed over the belief that we weren't really necessary, in fact, that we were expendable. But philosophy is something that is, I think, essential to who we are as human beings. And it starts really early. There's a misconception, I think, about philosophy, that it's something that is extremely complicated, dealing with abstract matters. And to some extent that may be so, but it's children from the earliest ages of consciousness and self-reflective consciousness start asking questions. They ask, why is the sky blue? Why? And when they get an answer to that question, they're not satisfied with that answer. They want to find out more. And so this question of why, what's the reason? What is the justification? These are questions that are inherently philosophical questions. And they're inherently reflective. So this goes back to Plato's idea of examination. When you examine a practice or a theory or a belief system, you ask, why is it that I believe what I believe? And you can push this question. It never stops, really, and that's what philosophy does. It's systematically so. So we're all engaged in it. Philosophy does it with a certain amount of rigor, and we need philosophers because they help us think through our basic assumptions about the various engagements that we have in life.
I think one of the problems, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that there are two very important branches in philosophy that people don't associate with philosophy directly. One is ethics, and in fact, in every profession these days, ethics is there's a course of ethics that is mandatory, where you're going to be a medical doctor, engineer, or business person. And the other one is critical thinking, something that all of us need on a daily life. Do you think that one of the reasons why people don't see the connection is because you philosophers haven't been more explicit about that connection?
Well, I certainly do think that there's a role for the philosopher as public intellectual that is not as well occupied, let's say, in America today as it has been, let's say, for example, in the France of the 1950s and 60s. I think philosophers have been marginalized to some extent in academia. I think there's a real need for us to, spread our wisdom and be out there more. Now, I think the technological revolution of the several years past has actually helped this, because there's many blogs and online outlets now for philosophers reaching folks that aren't necessarily already engaged in academic philosophy. But philosophy has both a PR problem in the sense that there's a misconception about what it is, and then it has a PR problem in the sense that we're not very good necessarily of broadcasting what it is that we do.
Yeah. Now, most philosophers tend to concentrate on a particular type of philosophy, and because there have been many types of philosophies through history. And my understanding is you have worked a lot on a particular philosopher called Immanuel Kant.
That is correct.
Can you please explain to our audience in a very brief way who was this person and why he is so important in the history of philosophy?
Kant is an interesting figure, I believe, and he perhaps to put the point most simply, is that there were two broad strands of philosophy that are still around today that were going on before Kant. One was called, or we today call, rationalism. The other was called empiricism. And to put the matter very simply, empiricism is essentially the belief that science is all there is to finding and seeking and arriving at the truth. That our knowledge has to be based in empirical, sensible facts. Experience is what matters most. Rationalism, on the other hand, is the belief that reason, thinking about the world, is what has to come first before we engage in any kind of experimental testing of truth, and so that somehow reason has primacy. What makes Kant so very interesting is that he tried to combine the two. And he said basically there's some truth, obviously, to the empirical way of looking at things, but there's also some truth to the rational way of looking at things. And what he did was then to try to come up with a system that combines the two. This immediately makes things a lot more complicated, which is why Kant is still one of the more difficult philosophers that we've seen. But it also makes things a lot more interesting. And I personally landed in Kant, so to speak, not out of an antiquarian interest in the history of philosophy, or thinking that, I want to know what somebody 300 years ago thought, but because these thoughts are still very relevant to the situation we're finding ourselves in today. Our current situation is essentially a version of empiricism. And though some of my fellow philosophers will hate me for saying this, I believe that in some ways we have, in our current philosophical life, not yet reached the point that Kant had reached in 1790.
Now, you mentioned science earlier, and it is interesting to me that the terminal degree in sciences and many other disciplines, except for the practical ones like medicine or education, the terminal degree is a doctorate in philosophy. Mm-hmm. Yet, we are not required to study philosophy to get a doctorate in philosophy. Do you find that kind of just a detail that is inconvenient, or we should be thinking more about really providing more of a background in terms of what philosophy is to people who hold such a degree?
This is a question that has many parts in a way. There's a historical part to it, and then there's also sort of the contemporary question to it. And the historical part is quite simply this: that not so long ago, up until around the early 1800s, maybe, there really wasn't a distinction between science and philosophy. They were the same thing. In fact, science was simply called natural philosophy. And then with certain advancements in science, it kind of spun off and became its own thing. But it still is, to its core, I think, a philosophical discipline in all its various forms, because it's a kind of reflection on the way the world hopefully, supposedly, maybe actually is. So science remains in that general ballpark of philosophical reflection on nature. Now, the current core doctrines of philosophy, or disciplines in philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, epistemology, and so forth, they are at some remove from the scientific operations that are going on in laboratories around the world today. But in a way, they're still connected through this historical lineage. Now, there's the contemporary side to this question is that we do, in philosophy, of course, today have many sub-disciplines, such as the philosophy of science, which itself is actually quite general, and then you have philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, philosophy of chemistry. So there's always a philosophy of that you can do. Now, in science education, when you get a PhD in science, I think it would be very useful to have some kind of aspect of that degree be composed of not just methodological questions, how do we construct a well-formed, well-designed experiment, but also what is it to have to have evidence? How does evidence speak to the formation of a hypothesis, to the justification of a hypothetical claim, and how does that lead to theory formation? And all of these are eminently philosophical questions. And I think any scientist worth their mettle would probably already have some perhaps homespun idea of how all this works. But to have some systematic reflection on these matters, I think, would be very useful for scientific education.
Now that you mentioned that, it came to my mind something I heard once, that a science professor asked some students, "Why are you in my class the first day of classes?" And some of them responded, "Because we are here to learn the truth."
Mm-hmm.
And he responded, "If you want to learn the truth, go to a philosophy class. If you want to learn the facts, stick here in this science class." Your take on that?
It's a very philosophical response. One way of looking at what science does, Karl Popper in the 20th century famously described scientific inquiry as engaged in not a pursuit of truth so much as really theory formation, and then the idea was what you do with these theories is you try to falsify them. So you'll always be able to say, theories will never be able to say that, capture the way the world really is. That would be getting at the truth of the matter. They'll always only get to the point where they're internally coherent with other theories, and if evidence were to come up that falsifies them, then we get to a point where we're going to have to revise our theory. But there's no God's eye point of view that we can assume, or we can simply step outside of our mindedness and say, here's our theory on the one hand, this is the world as it really is on the other hand, and we have a match. That's a position that is inherently unavailable to us. So I think that professor made a quite correct observation that science isn't, in fact, in the business of determining what the world ultimately truly is, or what the 19th century German philosophers called the absolute.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, going back to Kant, one of the things that he developed as a philosopher was what is called moral philosophy. And sometimes words do matter, because some people who are not so cognizant of his work may think, okay, so there is also immoral philosophy or amoral philosophy. Can you explain what moral philosophy is all about?
Moral philosophy has a bunch of different components. One thing that moral philosophy is about is trying to tell us what the correct action in a given situation might be. Kant famously said one of the core questions of philosophy is, what should I do? And philosophy is trying to answer that. And so specifically, what would the moral course of action in a given situation be? Now, that, of course, immediately raises the question, what is morality? What is so it's tied to values, it's tied to good and bad, or right and wrong action. So what makes an action in a given situation a right action or a wrong action? That's something that moral philosophy is trying to tell us. This part of philosophy, moral philosophy, is called essentially normative ethics. That's the part where philosophers actually try to tell us what to do and why. Then there's a further question, though, which is, what are these values anyway, and are they real? Are values is it an objective fact that letting the baby drown in the bathtub is a horrible thing to do or not? It's a value judgment. Do value judgments have an objective purchase on reality, or is it all just kind of subjective, if you will? And so that portion of moral philosophy that investigates what are values, are they real, and what is it to think about these, that's called metaethics. That's thinking. So meta means over or above. It's thinking about ethics itself. So you have ethics that tells us what to do, and then you have meta-ethics that tells us what ethics is. And once again, this is the kind of proliferation of theories that you get when you start thinking. Thinking is always a mental exercise about something, about some object or of discourse or other. Could be a fact in the world, it could be morality, could be something else. Once you start thinking, you can then think about your thinking. Or back to Plato, you could examine your thinking life. And so another way to get to come full circle to Plato here, Plato said, the unexamined life is not worth living. Yeah. You might say the unexamined examination is not worth having.
Okay.
So that's what philosophy is.
Now that view that you explain here lead us to believe that there is an ideal situation for things, an ideal solution for problems. Is that then directly connected with the German idealism that Kant was a great practitioner of?
It's the idea here is not so much that there's one end state, one ideal goal that we might have. The point is more that we it's very difficult for us as human beings, and philosophers have struggled with this since the dawn of philosophy, to escape our mindedness, as we call it, the fact that we're thinking creatures, and the only access we have to reality is through thought. So the idealism in this, I sometimes like to tell my students, you know how there's a saying, it's all in your head. I give a slightly different version of this. I like to say that it's all in your head, including your head.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, we can't escape thought. And this is an insight that the famous rationalist René Descartes had, that somehow thought has primacy. Thought comes first. Now, Kant then tried to complicate that picture by saying, wait a minute, you're forgetting about reality over here. But thought has this inescapability that means that we're never in, or at least it's very difficult to justify that we're in direct touch with reality, because the direct touch is always modulated, mediated through some measure of thinking about it.
It's interesting because this reminds me of one of the most famous anecdotes in the history of philosophy, because Plato was basically an idealist, and basically he said, where you think we are seeing is not what are actually there, is what we imagine because it's going through our minds. And Aristotle, who was a pupil of Plato, basically was the opposite. He based everything on observation. And when someone criticized Aristotle for criticizing Plato, Aristotle responded, I love my teacher Plato, but I love truth even more. Those are encapsulate what you're saying?
Yes, I mean, that's in fact the roots of the ancient Greek roots of this debate between rationalism and empiricism date right back to Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Okay. Now, Kant was also famous for talking about whether we can justify certain human actions, like oppression, for example. And I wonder if this is something that has been overlooked by politicians or talking heads, you name it, when dealing with trying to justify totalitarian states, dictatorship, and the like. How do you see that apparent contradiction there?
Well, I think that Kant's first point and first position about all of these matters comes out of his devotion to the Enlightenment. So Kant's position is, and quite famously he stated is, in his essay, What is Enlightenment? He says, Enlightenment is think for yourself. So in that sense, he is fundamentally opposed to any kind of oppression by a regime, because that essentially is supposed to take away the capacity of independent, autonomous thought from members of the population. So in that sense, there's no connection there between Kant and oppression. Now, Kant did have a political philosophy that also believed that as we enter into political systems, there's a certain degree of autonomy that we give up, and so exactly how that plays out is then very difficult. But it's not. There's no. Hegel, I think, has been more plausibly charged with being somebody who's on the side of a repressive regime than Prussian state.
Okay. My last question for you: what you are working on right now? What is your next big project?
I'm working on a number of projects. There's two big ones. One is a book on Kant's teleology. That's essentially Kant's philosophy of biology. And
just to explain to our audience, teleology basically is trying to go around.
So
and
telos
justify
telos is a goal or an end state that you're trying to reach, and one of the ways in which we understand biological life is to think of it in terms of organisms that somehow are functionally organized, that pursue aims, goals, and purposes, and that's what makes biological objects different, organisms in particular, different from physical and inanimate objects. And Kant has a lot to say about what that biological teleology looks like, how we can understand and justify it, and so forth. The other book project is is related but bigger in a way. My main interest is Kant's third critique. He wrote three big books. First critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. The second is the Critique of Practical Reason, and the third is the Critique of the Power of Judgment. And I've been working on this third book for a long time now, and my medium-term project is to write a monograph on the book in its entirety, because that's something. It's a very difficult book, and it's something it's not really been treated as a coherent book. People kind of dig into it and pick and choose what they can find, but it's very difficult to see what the coherence of this thing might be, which is strange because it's his book on systematicity and on the integration of parts and wholes. So it'd be very funny to have that book in particular be one that's kind of unorganized and unsystematic. So my goal is to show how the book on systematicity is in fact systematic.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Thomas Teufel, for this very interesting conversation about philosophy, truth, and some things that actually are happening right now in our society.
Thank you very much for having me.
And next week, we're going to have Dr. Rosanne McManus of the Department of Political Science, who will be talking about international security, another hot issue today. So stay tuned.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.